All right. So thank you once again for taking some time out of your Thursday to join now. Our second webinar to bring now members together from across the country and talk about our priority issue areas and how they're being impacted during COVID-19 and how we can take action. These are unprecedented times for all of us, but not new issues also. And so we are looking to bring together our research and experts and stories and lived experience and truth, and kind of take a big picture perspective and see what do we know about this issue and where can we as activists step in and help take action. And so sex work and sex trafficking and sex violence has been core to national now's issue areas since our founding over 50 years ago. And I'm incredibly thankful for this webinar to be partnered with Florida Now and to have, well, first of all, I want to give a shout out to Kim from the president of Florida Now. I'm not sure if she's able to join us on this call right now, but this webinar is entirely thanks to her leadership and brilliance in connecting us all and bringing us together. So thank you, Kim. We're all sending you lots of love right now for you and your family. And Kim is who connected me to Dr. Jill McCracken, who I'm very excited to introduce for our presentation. Before I get into introducing her and letting her take it away, I just want to give some overview that I have muted you all so that we can make sure that we're all hearing Jill when she speaks. But if you would like to unmute yourself when we have questions and answers, you can. I would also like for folks to feel free to use the chat throughout this whole webinar to ask questions. We're going to hold the questions until the end of the presentation, but I will be seeing them and tracking them and make sure to be sharing them with Jill once her presentation ends so that we can still have a good 20 minutes for question and discussion. So with that, I would like to introduce you or reintroduce, as some of you know her very well, to Dr. Jill McCracken, who is an Associate Professor of Rhetoric and Women and Gender Studies at the University of South Florida in St. Petersburg, and the co-founder / co-director of Sex Workers Outreach Program SWOP Behind Bars, an organization that provides direct support for incarcerated sex workers and victims of trafficking in United States prisons and jails. And she'll tell us all about her research and this work. So Jill, take it away.
Thank you so much, Sasha. And Kim, thank you so much for having me. Good afternoon, everyone. I really want to thank you all for having me today. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you about some subjects that I think many of us find to be incredibly important, and I would argue are at the foundation of equality and feminism. I want to start by saying I've struggled with how to begin this talk because I get tripped up by the language. I can't talk about my language without necessarily talking about my own positionality, which informs my research and my findings. So I'm going to ask for your patience if some of my language may be alienating. But before unpacking that, I want to talk and explain a little bit about who I am and how that relates to my work. So a list here, not necessarily in order of importance. The single mom thing is pretty up there, right? But I'm a feminist and a researcher. I focus primarily on what I call community-based participatory, or a lot of people call community-based participatory research, which basically means that I center the voices of the people who are most impacted by the research and ask them to help me come up with the questions and the answers. I've been doing research on prostitution and trafficking in the sex industry for over 15 years now, and I think it's really important that the people that we're working with, their voices are at the center. So if we were to be studying farm workers, per se, which is something that is a huge issue here in Florida. We would have farm workers at the center of the conversation asking us about how our policies should be created and what the working conditions are like. And I feel the same way about sex work and prostitution victims of trafficking. So when I began this research years ago as a PhD student, I actually worked with an organization that worked with how they defined it as, quote unquote, women who exchange sex for money or other gain. And that's how they talked about prostitution, right? And that's how the people talked about it in general. And I hung out with them for a good couple of years before I actually ever engaged in formal interviews with what I would call sex workers, even though they wouldn't identify with that term. And I'll talk about that shortly. And one of the reasons why I did that was because, again, I wanted them and their questions and their issues to be at the center of the research. I also identify as a sex worker advocate. And as luck would have it, shortly after, a couple years maybe into beginning my research, actually no, really early on into my research, I was approached by a leader in the sex worker rights movement, one of the founders of the Sex Workers Outreach Project USA, which is a national organization. And she asked me if I would consider being on the founding board. And I'd like to say that I think what she valued, I was going to say, I don't think she thought I was an expert necessarily. It was very early in my days. I think that she valued my passion and she valued my research, but what she really valued and wanted was that I could use my legal name. And that was a huge thing because so many sex workers who might want to step up in leadership roles, if you want to apply for a 501c3, which is what they were trying to do, they had to have legal names on their documents. So she asked me if I would serve on their board. And I said yes. And one of the reasons why I did this was because researchers, and I found this out as I've been a researcher now for a long time, researchers get flack because, rightly so, in my opinion, because we go into communities, most especially if they're marginalized communities, and we learn a lot with them, and we take a lot, and we take information, and then what we are criticized for is basically creating our careers off of that, and not necessarily giving back to the people with whom we are, or from whom we are creating our careers. And we get publications, and we get promotions, and we get all of these things. And so early on, when I started doing this research, it was really important to me that I was giving back to the communities that I was working with and learning from. And so that was another reason why I decided to join the organization. And it really shifted my perspective, because what I ended up learning a lot and basically hanging out with a lot of sex workers, many of whom are on this call, many of whom are now members, right? And it really shifted my perspective as far as being a distant researcher and being someone who's hanging out with activists and advocates. So I have to claim that positionality as well. And I have continued. I'm no longer on the national board, but I serve on my local. SWOP is a national organization. We have chapters all over. I serve on SWOP Tampa Bay as a co-facilitator. And then, as was said about my bio, I am the co-founder and co-director of SWOP Behind Bars, which I'll sprinkle a little bit in about that. We've been around since 2016, and it's really changed a lot of my perceptions, specifically about people who are incarcerated, people who have trafficking charges, people who have prostitution charges. And Alex Andrews and I, my co-founder and director, created this chapter because we knew that people that were incarcerated are disproportionately impacted by the laws that criminalize prostitution, but are not really heard from in the sex worker rights movement. And it's been an amazing journey and has really opened my eyes to a lot of things. So I'm incredibly grateful for that part of my work. So now I'll talk a little bit about terminology. I think that our terminology reflects our values and our beliefs, and that informs our legislative policies, right? And as I know that many of you know, the values and beliefs about prostitution and sex work undergird some of the most controversial aspects around policy conversations. So prostitution is a term that I use when I discuss legislation, because prostitution is the word used to talk about a specific crime, right? The exchange of a sexual act for money in most of the US. The term prostitute, I identify and feel that it's pejorative largely because the act of prostitution is attributed as an identity. So something that someone may engage in is then viewed as an identity. And I think that is a problem. I actually use the word sex worker, right? Which I realize implies a choice, and we're going to talk a little bit about choice and coercion shortly, but I realize it implies a choice or coming to it from a place of power, and yet I choose to err on the side of agency and choice because I feel it does an even greater disservice to assume that prostitution is always something that is done to someone. And so we have the language prostituted person, which I understand and actually have read a lot about and have a deeper appreciation for this term because it actually is trying to place the focus on all of the systemic oppressions that we all live in, but most impact people who are engaged in prostitution. So the idea is to take away this focus on the individual and say, look at the systemic oppressions that this person is operating in. And I understand that. I choose not to use it because, again, it seems to imply that no one can ever choose to engage in prostitution. And I know that that's just not the reality. So that's my explanation of the language that I use. The word sex work actually was created by a sex worker, Carol Lee, who's a sex worker and an advocate, activist, and actually a good friend and colleague of mine. And I use her words here because I think they're really poignant. She says, I wanted to reconcile my feminist goals with the reality of my life and the lives of the women I knew. I wanted to create an atmosphere of tolerance within and outside the women's movement for women working in the sex industry. And I find that, especially for this conversation and this talk, really important because she was trying to communicate with people in the women's movement, and she was trying to say, look, sex work can be a job. Just like a postal worker or a sanitation worker or a social worker. And so that is the word that I typically use when I don't ask someone how they identify, and then I use whatever word they use that they would want to be identified as. So in general, sex work includes a range of erotic labor, both legal and illegal, and it is the exchange of sex or sexualized intimacy for something of value. It includes men and women and transgender individuals. So examples of legal would be erotic dancing, pornography, phone sex operators. Illegal is prostitution within the US outside of some counties in Nevada, sometimes dominatrix. It just depends on the state. Sex workers, like teachers, lawyers, doctors, custodians, they're our neighbors, they're our friends, they're our community members. They're all around us all the time. So I'll touch briefly on trafficking and how it's defined in the US. So according to the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, sex trafficking is in which a commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or in which the person induced to perform such an act has not attained 18 years of age. It's also the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for labor or services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of subjection to involuntary servitude, peonage, debt, bondage, or slavery. And there's different categories of trafficking, right? And this is also outlined in the Trafficking in Persons report. So there's forced labor and forced child labor, which it happens in domestic, agriculture, and factories, and lots of other. The service industry is right with this. It also includes sex trafficking and child sex trafficking, bonded labor or debt bondage, and unlawful recruitment and use of child soldiers. So I include this graphic here. This is from the International Labor Organization, and this graphic they created in 2014. I have not been able to find a more updated one, but they show, and I know it's hard to read, but they show that forced labor exploitation is roughly 2/3 of the exploitation that's out there. And I think that what we have a tendency to do, at least in the US and perhaps internationally, is equate trafficking with sex trafficking. And although sex trafficking is egregious and we absolutely need to address it, we also have to address labor trafficking. And so I want to call attention to that, even though that's not my area of expertise in terms of research, that it's out there and we all benefit from it in different areas. So I think it's important just to be aware that it's a huge problem here and everywhere internationally. So it's important to know that sex work and trafficking of individuals in the sex industry are fundamentally different and should be considered as such. And choice and coercion, sex prostitution actually works on a continuum of choice and coercion. Many people engage in prostitution that are fully choosing it, and there are people who are trafficked and they are coerced into it. And then there are a lot of people in the middle who may be choosing it for a lot of different reasons. And those are greater and less actual choice, or how we would view choice, right? I would argue that a significant number of sex workers are compelled by poverty, misogyny, and racism, along with lots of other oppressive circumstances. And as I know you all know, we have to work to create a world where trans people can be hired in mainstream jobs, where people of color have equal opportunity and are not at greater risk of violence, and where everyone can earn a living wage, right? We're actually seeing the repercussions of this even more so right now with COVID-19. So in general, we have to acknowledge, or I think it's really important to acknowledge, that sex work spans continuums of choice. But sex work requires consent, and trafficking of individuals for sex requires sexual violence, coercion, the absence of consent, or when an individual is under 18. And these continuums of choice, as I have referenced, exist in other industries like service, agriculture, manufacturing. As feminists, I think it's really important that we acknowledge the tension between choosing and not choosing, and recognize that the word choice does not imply everyone is operating under the same sets of privileges or oppressions. So a common framework that I encounter a lot here in the US especially is this idea that prostitution is always exploitative. Many of us who are not sex workers may view prostitution as a problem and may associate sex work with exploitation and gender inequality. And often those who sell sex are considered to be victims exploited by buyers and by the sex trade in general. And many people find it hard to believe that someone could actually choose to be a sex worker, or that some people actually enjoy it. But it's important to note, as I have said, that our experiences and choices are always mediated by race and class and other systemic factors, right? And these influences impact all of our decisions. But if we assume that prostitution is always exploitative, there's some underlying beliefs there, right? That it's always inherently exploitative and victimizing, that all sex workers are victims, that no one can choose it, and that using the term sex work, and I've heard this, right, that using the term sex work makes systemic violence and oppression invisible. I disagree. And I think it's really important that we hold space for this term sex work, and also the incredibly problematic issues that we face in our world every day. I think it's possible to use the word sex work and also understand that there are circumstances that people live in which they may engage in prostitution and may not want to be doing it, but they are not considered, nor would they consider themselves to be victims of trafficking. So one of the problems with these viewpoints or underlying beliefs that we found is that there tends to be this conflation between prostitution and trafficking. And that is a huge problem for both victims of trafficking and for consenting sex workers. So the Lancet, which is a very well-known medical journal, did a special issue in 2015 on sex work and HIV. And they found that trafficking occurs in sex work as it does in other types of labor. However, the issue of trafficking in sex work has been singled out, its scale and potential for harm frequently misstated or exaggerated to bolster anti-prostitution arguments, inflame public opinion, and justify repressive and counterproductive police action. Conflation of sex work with trafficking leads not only to difficulties with definition and harm to sex workers on the ground, but also to conflicts that undermine HIV prevention. So they're looking at it from a medical perspective, but they're also looking at it in terms of the rights and the ability that people have to get their needs met. So in general, conflating prostitution and trafficking silences the voices of sex workers and individuals that are choosing to work in the sex industry. And it shifts the resources from actual victims of trafficking in the sex industry. And I would argue harms both, because we're putting this whole label onto this entire group of people that are acting from very different perspectives and different circumstances. So our job, and one of my jobs in approaching this talk today, I think, is to ask ourselves which legislation policies actually reduce harm to sex workers and victims of trafficking. So I want to start by talking a little bit about prostitution legislation. I hear the words around legislation get thrown around in the media all kinds of times, where people will say legalize prostitution when they're actually talking about decriminalizing aspects of prostitution. So I just want to give a quick overview. There's basically 4 models when it comes to prostitution legislation. The first is criminalization. All aspects of prostitution are criminalized. That's what we have here in the US outside of certain counties in Nevada. Then we have legalization, where prostitution is legal and regulated, meaning you must meet certain requirements. You must be a citizen, you must pass health screenings. It depends on where you are and who's legalizing it. We then have what's called partial decriminalization, which is known as in demand, or the Swedish Nordic equality model. Those names get thrown around a lot. Basically, it criminalizes the buyer, the person who is purchasing the sex, and it decriminalizes the seller. We'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. And then finally, we have decriminalization, which decriminalizes or repeals laws against the buying and selling of sex, but does not repeal any laws against force, fraud, or coercion, or when the sex is engaged with someone who's under 18. So I want to just think about the impacts of these different models a little bit. I think most of us can agree that the full criminalization of prostitution creates challenges for consensual sex workers and victims of trafficking. So this is one study that was done in 2016. The National Survivor Network conducted a survey on the impact of criminal arrest and detention on survivors of human trafficking. And they found that 91% of 130 trafficking survivor respondents reported having been arrested. 42 reported they had been arrested as minors. 40% reported being arrested 9 times or more. 73% reported losing or not receiving employment because of their criminal records. And 58% suffered barriers to accessing safe and affordable housing due to their past criminal convictions. I have a research assistant who's actually been helping me dig up a lot of this research, Sydney Merritt. I want to acknowledge her. She actually was reading some Simone de Beauvoir, and I thought it was relevant to bring her in at this point. I'm thinking that I'm losing my, here we go. So Simone de Beauvoir in 1953 in The Second Sex, so long as the prostitute is denied the rights of a person, she sums up all the forms of feminine slavery at once. So currently, sex workers are unable to report violence perpetuated against them without fear of arrest and criminal charges. And this prevents sex workers from accessing the criminal legal system. It allows predators to target sex workers and non-sex workers alike, which maintains societal tolerance of violence against women and minorities. So in general, the research findings show that arrests do not address the underlying issues of why people are engaging in prostitution in the first place. They often lead to charges related to prostitution and citizen status if there's someone is not a citizen, and they require survivors to navigate the criminal legal system as a defendant, which can worsen people's circumstances if they are a victim of trafficking and can actually make them more vulnerable to increased exploitation. So criminalization in general increases sex workers and trafficking victims' vulnerability to abusers' violence. It promotes impunity and pushes sex work and trafficking underground and increases stigma and discrimination. So with legalization, typically what we find is that it places the power in the hands of the managers, business owners, and the government. So it doesn't necessarily place the power in the workers' hands. And this is a problem because it requires sex workers to meet certain criteria, as I mentioned. And because it requires this criteria, there's certain people that don't meet that criteria, but they still may need to work to get their needs met. And so there's like 2 classes, one that's legal and one that's illegal. And those people who do not meet the criteria are at further risk of exploitation and violence. And once again, the power structures are created by the people that are in management or the government. So I want to turn, and we'll spend a little bit more time on end demand or partial decriminalization, because it's one that's been talked about a lot, I know, in now and also internationally, right? It actually was created, the Swedish model, in 1999. It is now termed the Nordic model. It was introduced in Norway in 2009. Canada is now instituting it. And so it's one of these things that is getting a lot of attention and has a lot of different names, right? People often argue that prostitution is inherently violent and therefore should be criminalized, and individuals who are selling sex are often viewed as having less power or resources, and therefore people argue they should not be criminalized. And so the focus moves to the buyers of sex. There is significant evidence-based research that has tried to assess the impact of partial decriminalization or end demand on a variety of countries. And I include some of that information here. I don't want to throw a million statistics at you. And I also include a very extensive reference list at the end of this PowerPoint. And I encourage you to dig into not only that, but the other evidence-based research that's out there. But in general, studies find that when clients are criminalized, negotiations are still pushed further into the shadows, putting workers at greater risk. Clients are trying to hurry along. They're afraid of getting arrested or whatever it might be. Sex workers have less negotiating power, right? Because they find that they're being rushed. They don't have as much time to assess risks. Many studies find that the good clients are no longer there and they're left with the bad or predatory clients. But in general, if there are fewer clients, sex workers are left to take clients that they might not otherwise take because they need to get their needs met, right? So I include two quotes here that reference the number of clients reduced that leave sex workers in need of money and resources. One says, prostitution is not driven by demand, but by the economic needs of people. And less income made me more desperate. They also find that the prevalence of pimps or third parties has increased because prostitution cannot take place openly. This is really interesting because the purpose of this legislation was to decrease that exploitation. But what's happening is because people are worried about doing that, they're then going to managers or people who could potentially exploit them. And not all managers are exploiters, but they have found, the studies have found that there's an increase. There's a problem with people who are not citizens, who are migrants, right? And they can be deported. Trafficking victims can and are deported. Sex workers are still afraid to go to the police to report violence because they're fear that they'll lose their money or they'll lose their housing. And clients, the buyers, are not likely, if ever, to report that something seems amiss, that there seems to be exploitation or trafficking, because they're committing a crime. So sex workers in general are placed in situations where they take clients, as I said, that they might not otherwise work with, accept less money, and are ultimately more vulnerable to violence. And these systemic issues disproportionately impact people who are trans and sex workers of color. And we see this again and again and again. They're disproportionately impacted by the criminalization, but they're also disproportionately impacted by the existing power struggles. So there was a report that I read extensively, and I find it unique, and I include it at length here because it was actually from Norway. It was done in Oslo. So what happened was they did some surveys in 2007 and 8. As I said earlier, Norway brought in the end demand model, the Swedish model, in 2009. And then this research was done in 2010-11, so about 2 years after. So they were in a unique place where they had these surveys at 2007 and 8, prior to the legislation, and then 2010-11, so about 2 years later. And I include this report at length because it touches on a lot of these issues, right? And so in the report, Bordal finds this data does not answer whether the high amount of violence and the vulnerability women in prostitution experience is caused by the criminalization of the purchase of sexual services or other factors. But what we can state with certainty is that there are no fewer women in prostitution who report being exposed to violence subsequent to the introduction of the sex purchase law, their name, and that women in prostitution is a group that is still highly vulnerable. The report, quote, ascertains that the number of respondents that are exposed to violence in prostitution has not decreased. The numbers are, if anything, pointing in the opposite direction. In the 2007-8 survey, 52% of participants reported experiencing violence in the course of their career in prostitution. In the 2012 survey, 59% reported violent experiences in prostitution in the last 3 years. This report shows that violence and vulnerability among women in prostitution discussed here have not been reduced in the same time period. Women in prostitution are still highly vulnerable to violence. They are frequently subjected to violence, threats, and harassment, and it is primarily the customers who expose the women to violence. The violence experienced by the women is often severe and at times life-threatening. The findings of this report show that prostitution has become more individualized and that fewer people seek out support services after being subjected to violence. Additionally, some of the women feel that they have little legal protection because parts of the legal framework, which is in principle intended to protect the women, also leads to the women not going to the police for help. They're worried about losing their apartments or their livelihood. And some of the women also experience that they now have to protect the customers from being fined. This means that the customers have gone from being a form of business partner to an ally, while at the same time, the police have gone from being an ally the women could go to for protection to someone they themselves have to protect the customers from. So if we think about the reason why this legislation was created, right, that we need to protect the women, and then we're looking at the way that this has actually played out a couple of years after, we see that it's not necessarily having that effect. And that's what we need to be looking at, is evidence-based research, right? So criminalization in general creates and fuels stigma and discrimination, which creates vulnerability. And it also sends the message that the ultimate goal here is to get rid of prostitution, even at the expense of human rights. And I think that that is a problem. Any legislation that removes power from the workers and those most marginalized creates the conditions for vulnerability, which can result then in exploitation and violence and trafficking. So now I want to shift gears and talk a little bit about decriminalization. In 2015, Amnesty International, after doing research in 4 countries and doing extensive research, came out and authorized the International Board to develop and adopt, quote, a policy that supports the full decriminalization of all aspects of consensual sex work. The policy will also call on states to ensure that sex workers enjoy full and equal legal protection from exploitation, trafficking, and violence. And it draws on extensive resources, which I include there. So what is the decriminalization of prostitution? People say the decriminalization of prostitution does not empower or protect women in particular in any way, which I disagree. I base this disagreement on evidence-based research, some of which is my own, but also on the many lived experiences I've encountered in my years as a scholar and an activist. So, decriminalization repeals all laws that criminalize adult consensual sex and related activities, including laws criminalizing sex work, buying, soliciting, or procuring, brothel keeping, and management of sex work, and vagrancy, loitering, and public nuisance. These are laws that often are used to target sex workers and clients, but often used to target sex workers. It does not repeal any laws against trafficking, child sexual exploitation, or other forms of violence. Decriminalization treats prostitution as a social issue rather than a criminal one, and it thereby tries to safeguard the human rights of sex workers, to protect them from violence and exploitation, and to promote their welfare and occupational health and safety. Currently, there's only one country in the world who has full decriminalization, and that's New Zealand. The New Zealand Prostitutes Collective, which was co-founded by Catherine Healy, who may actually be on this call, is an organization run by sex workers for sex workers and advocates for the human rights, health, and well-being of sex workers. They had a long-standing relationship working with the government to give out condoms and help meet the needs of sex workers. And they were able to use this relationship to help draft legislation, which was then passed, the Prostitution Reform Act in 2003, which is about, what now, 17 years ago, right? And one of the things that I really like about the Prostitution Reform Act, first and foremost, is that sex workers were at the forefront of being able to help write and design this policy, which needs to happen. So I give some overview here. The purpose of this act is to decriminalize prostitution while not endorsing or morally sanctioning prostitution or its use, and to create a framework that safeguards the human rights of sex workers and protects them from exploitation, promotes the welfare and occupational health and safety of sex workers, is conducive to public health, prohibits the use in prostitution of persons under 18 years of age, and implements certain other related reforms. So if we think about the language here in this legislation, we're looking at rights-based and public health concerns. And I think that's incredibly important to acknowledge. So the New Zealand Prostitution Reform Act, no one under the age of 18 can legally engage in prostitution. Of course, exploitation and trafficking is illegal. The law requires condoms be worn for all sexual activities, and sex worker rights are guaranteed through employment and human rights legislation. And that's actually impacting people directly. I'll talk about in a minute with COVID-19 right now. So I had the opportunity in 2018 to go to New Zealand on a Fulbright specialist project and work with the New Zealand Prostitutes Collective on a community-based study. And the research question was ultimately 15 years after this prostitution policy, this legislation has passed, what is the impact of decriminalization of prostitution on violence and exploitation in the sex industry? So I interviewed 33 sex workers. I interviewed 34 individuals who work closely with sex workers, including brothel operators, clients, all kinds of different people, and many of whom were current and former sex workers as well. A total of 55 one-on-one interviews and 14 focus groups of up to 4 people. So these are just a quick look at some of the findings. The biggest challenges that sex workers face is discrimination and stigma, not violence. Actually, many of them said not enough clients was one of their biggest challenges, right? Because again, people still have needs that they need to get met. No sex workers had experienced violence from police officers since prostitution was decriminalized. None that I had spoken to, of course. This is huge. In the US, you can't hear of sex workers who don't experience violence at the hands of police. It's a huge problem. A majority of participants reported that if they encountered violence or exploitation from anyone, that they would go to the police or they would go to the New Zealand Prostitutes Collective, which has a well-established relationship with the police. So they do have recourse if they're encountering violence or exploitation or someone's trying to steal from them or whatever it is. And a majority of the sex workers state that police provide a protective presence that prevents violence perpetuated by clients and predators. So in general, and this is my research, but many other people's research, which I include in the references, impact of decrim improves safety, decreases violence, decreases exploitation and risks for exploitation, because we know that people have recourse. They can go to the police or the New Zealand Prostitutes Collective. And it decreases the risk of HIV and other sexually transmitted infections. It finally increases job satisfaction and quality of life. And we're seeing that right now with COVID-19, where I will touch on briefly. I want to make sure we have time for questions, where people who are sex workers are getting unemployment right now, which is unheard of here in the US. Sex workers, and I really want to emphasize this, there was just an amnesty law passed this past year in California, where anyone can come forward if they have experienced or have seen violence or trafficking and not risk arrest. Sex workers and clients are uniquely positioned to know if something is happening, exploitation or trafficking is happening. And if they're empowered to be able to go forward and report that, that is more likely to happen. In a criminalized system, that's not going to happen. And sex worker organizations are also uniquely positioned to help in this situation. And I've learned a lot about this in my work with SWOP Behind Bars. So I have a tendency to try to look at this from a human rights perspective, right? And to ask if the individual, how the individual in the sex work industry, how they identify. Are they choosing it? Are they being exploited? And to expect that these questions and answers are not going to be simple, because many times that's not how these questions go. Many times they can be, but often they are not as simple as they can be. But we need to be looking at it from the perspective of the individual. Sex workers, as I've said, and victims of trafficking must be at the forefront of answering these questions. We cannot answer these questions for others, and they also must be at the forefront of our policy discussions. So I am realizing that time is flying by, and I do want to make sure we have time for questions. I just can't leave this conversation without acknowledging the fact that there are so many people who are struggling right now with COVID-19, and most importantly are sex workers. I think that they have very few safety nets at all at this point. Despite the heightened vulnerability that sex workers face under COVID-19, the vast majority of government economic relief efforts exclude sex workers on the grounds that sex work is criminalized and illegitimate. As a result, sex workers' organizations around the world have not only set up mutual help and solidarity systems, but renewed their calls for decriminalization with an unprecedented sense of urgency. Their response is a rallying cry that must be heard. And I just want to say that our $2.4 trillion CARES Act, of course, does not cover people who are engaged in the illegal sex industry, but it doesn't even cover people who are engaged in the legal sex industry. And this is an incredible problem, right? Because we have what's called the prurient sexual nature. If you have a business with a prurient sexual nature, you cannot qualify for small business loans. In New Zealand, since I've talked about this briefly, and I'm not going to read these quotes, but I will say that they basically are providing unemployment very quickly and easily for people who are in the sex industry. It was designed as part of the legislation that if people wanted to leave the sex industry, they would have access to this money right away. And that law enforcement is actually helping meet people who are working on the street to help navigate to get them access to this money. So what can we do? I think most importantly, we have to address the underlying issues. And again, I'm going to draw on Simone de Beauvoir. The truth is that in a world where misery and unemployment prevail, there'll be people to enter any profession that is open, more especially as these occupations pay better than many others. It is pure hypocrisy to wonder at the supply that masculine demand stimulates. That is simply the action of an elementary and universal economic process. Of all the causes of prostitution, wrote Parent Deschalais in his report of 1857, none is more important than unemployment and the poverty inevitably resulting from low wages. So payment for sex may be a form of coercion, absolutely, just like payment for any kind of work. So we have to work together, as I know now is doing on so many fronts, to try to alleviate these underlying vulnerabilities, these underlying oppressive circumstances that can lead people into making choices that they may not want to make. And if we want a country where fewer people are pushed into selling sex, we have to address the underlying reasons why they do it. Simultaneously, we also have to respect the voices of those who do want to work in the sex industry and who choose it. So I just want to end with a few strategies for change: to rely on evidence-based research to inform policy and legislation, to listen to those, I know I've said this, but it's so important, who are most impacted and center their voices in policy discussions. Absolutely fight the systemic oppression that individuals who do not want to be in the sex industry can leave and find other employment, which means vacating and stopping the criminalization on all fronts, but vacating criminal charges, because people who have criminal records with prostitution charges cannot find mainstream employment. They cannot find places to live. It's a huge problem, and they're actually forced to go into underground economies. I think that if we can focus on human rights-based outcomes, so increasing our access to safe living and working conditions, and measure progress in how many people have we housed, how many people are we feeding, how many people do we have access to healthcare, as opposed to measuring success in arrest rates, right? Or measuring success in criminalization. And so holding these ideas together, that there is this concept of sex work, but there also is this incredible problematic exploitation, oppression, vulnerability, and how can we look at legislation to reduce harm? And I would argue that decriminalization is our best option for doing that and trying to create equality and human rights for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Jill. That was awesome. That was so much really helpful information for breaking down the very different parts of this. There's been a very active chat that we can see how much we can get through. One question I see is from Linda: why are sex workers afraid to go to the police and report if the Nordic model doesn't criminalize the sex worker? I think that's a good question.
What I have found in the research is that I've never done research in a country where the Nordic model exists myself, but what I have seen is that They're afraid of violence being perpetuated against them by the police. That still does happen. They're afraid of losing the access to the resources that they do have. We live in a misogynistic society. So oftentimes people who are engaged in prostitution are blamed for the fact that they're there. And because they're in a less, oftentimes powerless position, they can then be exploited. So one of the reports that I read talked specifically about the fact that they were afraid that they would lose their apartment. They might be afraid of losing access to their children because they're engaged in prostitution. So there's a lot of different reasons why. I thought what was really telling about the article that I didn't choose to include was the fact that they are actually trying to protect their clients, because their client base is really important to them. So if they are going to the police, they're risking losing clients. And so that's a problem as well.
Thank you. I see another question from Jean. Do you have data on the numbers of buyers who were charged and convicted for their acts of violence in New Zealand?
No, I do not have that information. I don't. I think that's an interesting question, because I guess the assumption there, and I'm trying to remember the exact wording, is the number of buyers who are convicted of, can you repeat that, Sasha?
Violence. It was
Convicted of violence. So I think that's interesting, because I guess, no, I don't know if those kind of numbers are being kept. It would be interesting to know, the assumption being that they're trying to get at, they're trying to purchase sex, but then they're committing violence, and they're, whatever it is that they may be doing, sexual violence or robbery. I don't know if New Zealand keeps those numbers in terms of just violence perpetuated against people versus sex buyers who are perpetuating violence against people.
Thank you.
Good question.
I don't actually see any questions, or couldn't identify any questions from the chat. So if you have another one that we haven't asked yet, we still have 10 more minutes. You can ask it now.
Or comments, or, in general. I know we have some sex workers, I think you said earlier, and just a lot of different people here, different perspectives.
Are there ways that people can be supportive to sex workers right now during the pandemic, like mutual relief funds, perhaps, that people can donate, since a lot of them aren't able to apply for the federal
CARES Act? Yeah, absolutely. There's quite a few, and if you'd like, I can come up with a list of different organizations that are basically creating these kind of things. We're trying to, like, for instance, in Tampa Bay, we have a fund that people can donate to, and it's led by sex workers, a sex worker solidarity network. It's led by sex workers, and it's distributed to sex workers. All of the money that I'm donating right now I'm giving to sex worker-led organizations, because I realize that they are disproportionately hit. So I can come up with a list of organizations. A lot of people are actually creating Amazon wish lists, so you can actually go and buy things or put money on someone's wish list so that they can purchase what they need. And that's an option as well.
Thank you. I see another question from Lorelei. What's a good way to distinguish an anti-trafficking organization that is trustworthy?
I guess I would ask, how do they talk about sex work, and do they have sex workers that are volunteering and working with them? The language is important. The language that we use to talk about these things does, in my opinion, represent how our beliefs are. So when I talk to anti-trafficking organizations, I straight up ask them, what is your stance on prostitution? What is your stance on people? Can people choose prostitution? And try to get a sense of where they're at with that. Many anti-trafficking organizations will require, if they provide housing or services, that people stop engaging in selling sex. And I find that to be problematic, because people can be in a trafficking situation and also be a consenting sex work. And I know a lot of people who have had those experiences. And I think that to try to force someone into something that may not be what is best for them at the moment is not necessarily helpful, can actually, kind of paternalizes the situation in some ways. And I think that's problematic. So I think just having a conversation about it can be really helpful.
I have another question. I've heard that I'm assuming that means sex workers, become unable to live with a partner or roommate, both increase safety, because in the way the Nordic model is enacted, it considers anyone living with a sex worker to be a pimp and therefore can arrest them.
That is a huge problem. I think that is not just a problem under the Nordic model, but living off of the proceeds of a sex worker is, and actually one of the things that I didn't have time to talk about, but sex workers working together and trying to create safety, that is a problem, because people then could be accused of trafficking each other. But living off of the avails of prostitution absolutely can be viewed as, oh, well, you're trafficking. There's also situations where a partner, when in my very early days of working on a research project with street-based workers, there would be partners who would be looking out for each other, right? One woman who had a lesbian partner, and I would say, so would we say that that is her pimp? Just because they're women doesn't mean that they can't be exploiting each other, but they were also trying to help each other. They were looking out for getting the license plate, making sure they're safe. Are they coming back? So those kind of relationships are viewed as pimp or predatory or exploitative or trafficking. And that is incredibly problematic if that's not the way that the situation is really happening in reality. I think empowering people to speak their truth and not trying to put a message on them, you must be a victim, you must be this, you must be that. We see this in domestic violence relationships all the time where, yeah, it's messy and it's complicated. And I think that one of the challenges that we see, what I have seen increasingly with prostitution, is that domestic violence often does get involved and it can become an exploitative situation. And then there can be times when it's not exploitative. And I think it's really important I advocate that we use harm reduction models, which means we place the focus on the person and what is in their best interest and what is it that they want? What is it that they want to accomplish? And how can I help support them in that? And not necessarily trying to put a narrative on them that they may not identify with.
I see another question from Jean about what does the term sex industry include?
Wow. I mean, I would say the sex industry is pretty broad, right? I mean, it includes, it's funny, I've heard recently, I don't have the documentation if anyone wants to speak in the chat or wherever about this, that people who make sex toys are excluded from the CARES Act, right? So even the manufacturing of sex toys, I would say that's part of the sex industry, right? So I think it's incredibly broad. The sex industry, some people will even go, I've heard there's people in Seattle that sell coffee and they're very scantily clad, right? And I'm sure it's another place besides Seattle, but I just read about that once. I'm like, is that the sex industry? Is Hooters the sex industry? It can be pretty broad, right? Sex sells, as we know.
I have another question about advice for working with a parliament that has thrown out decrim bill after decrim bill. For example, in Adelaide, they have a situation where the street-based sex work community was going to be thrown under the bus in legislation. So there is a divide between sex workers wanting to wait for best practice legislation that leaves no one behind, and those who want to move ahead for some progress for the rest of the community. I think that's probably true in lots of states.
Yeah, there's been a lot of different bills that have tried to be, and it's caused a lot of controversy, right? There's a lot of controversy. There's been a lot of controversy, as we know, with it now. I don't know how to answer your question. I think it's really important that we not try to decriminalize certain parts of prostitution. Like there's been proposals in other countries, well, let's decriminalize, or it has been, let's decriminalize indoor, but criminalize outdoor. Those kind of, classifications I think are incredibly problematic. I don't know the details about what you're talking about in terms of, but I think throwing especially people who have less access to power under the bus is really, really challenging. And I would try to not let that happen.
I think I have maybe one last question, unless maybe we can sneak another one in. Um, is there a difference in the experience, do you think, between, or the policy around between male sex workers and female sex workers? Specifically, the question is, would it not further the movement to have more male sex workers advocating too? I think there is a gendered aspect to this whole conversation.
What?
I think there's a gendered aspect to this whole conversation that we can talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's interesting because I think that when we think about male sex workers, we have to think about the whole range. There are a lot of boys and young men who have been exploited for trafficking. There are a lot of men who have been exploited, and then there's a lot of sex workers who are choosing it. I think that what actually would be really incredibly beneficial is if people felt empowered, male or female or genderqueer, non-binary, to come forward and talk about being sex workers, to be able to be open about it and to say, this is a part of our lives, this is what's happening. And if we can create the conditions whereby no one ever has to work in the sex industry if they don't want to, and everybody who works in the sex industry, for whatever reasons, it fits their schedule, they like the money, they whatever, they're there because they want to be there, then that would help move the conversation forward. I think it's important for us to not think about our own perhaps personal morality or what we would think is right or wrong, and more think about the legislative policy. And I wish our legislators could hear this. The legislative policy that's going to protect and prevent violence and exploitation and trafficking, which we all know is so incredibly egregious, right? And to try to implement that into our legislative systems, as opposed to trying to quote unquote police what people are doing with their bodies, especially adults who are choosing to do whatever it is that they're doing. I think about in demand, I was thinking about this last night, and I'm like, in the gendered stereotypical world where people used to go to bars and, you know, the demand of men at the bar is there, but it doesn't mean that the women are all going to just necessarily do it. This is an economic crisis for the people that are engaging in prostitution who don't really want to be there. It doesn't have, people can demand it all day long. And unless there's some kind of an economic benefit there, it's not going to happen. So ultimately, and I may have shifted, I did shift completely, sorry, from answering your question. I think the more people can speak up about the underlying issues, and yes, by all means, male sex workers, speak, come out and talk about your needs, because there's all different kinds of gendered needs that are happening, right? So I'll stop there.
Oops, I saw I was muted. Thank you so much, Jill. Let's everyone give her a big virtual round.
Muted. Well, thank you all for being here, and I'm happy. Oh, I meant to. I do have like a million references, and my.
Oh, I just stopped sharing, but.
Oh, you stopped it? Oh, okay. Anyway, you can access my email address if you want it, and feel free to reach out to me. And thank you so much for being here. I appreciate it.
Of course. Yes, we will be sending out the PowerPoint slide with all the resources and a recording of this call, so you can share it with your friends and tell them that they should all join now and become a member this year. And you can do that by going to your state Now chapter website, or going to the National Now website also. So thank you again. It was so great to see you all from all over the country and the world. I don't even know what time it is in Australia, but I'm sure it's different.
Yeah, thank you all for coming, especially my New Zealand friends. Thank you so much for being here. I appreciate it.